Close the gates! The Jews are marching right to Jericho. The Canaanites are scared, but they feel safe inside their city because it's big and strong. They're about to learn, though, that when God has a plan, nothing stands in his way, not even the mighty walls of Jericho. The Walls That Fell Down Flat by Jennifer Rees Larcombe, illustrated by Steve Bjorkman. The Walls That Fell Down Flat, from Joshua 6 in the Old Testament of the Bible. For 40 years, the people of Canaan had been worried. They knew the Jews were prowling about in the desert, ready to come and take over their land. Why are they waiting so long? They asked each other. Now the Canaanites were bad people. They were so scared of their pretend gods that sometimes they threw people into a fire. They thought that would please their pretend gods, but instead it made the real God very angry indeed. "These people are so cruel," he said. "It is time I gave their land to the Jews, just as I have always promised." "They're coming!" screamed the Canaanites one day. "Look at the dust cloud out in the desert!" "But they'll never get over the Jordan River," they told each other. "It's far too deep and wide." But as they watched the priests carry a golden box into the water, the river stopped flowing, and all the Jews walked through the riverbed just as God had told them. "Run into Jericho!" shouted the Canaanites. "The walls of the city are so thick we'll be safe there." As the huge iron gates slammed shut, they felt much better, and when nothing happened for a while, the Canaanites began to laugh. "They're scared," they said, but they were wrong. The Jews had learned to trust God in those 40 long years in the desert, and they were just waiting for him to tell them what to do next. Joshua was their leader now that Moses had died, and the people knew that God was with him. Of course, there was no way they could ever get into Jericho. Those walls were far too strong. But God had a plan for them. Early one morning, the Canaanites were awakened by a strange sound. "The Jews are marching around our city," they said, "carrying a golden box and blowing their trumpets." Every day for a week, the same thing happened, and the Canaanites began to get nervous. "What are they trying to do?" they whispered. On the 7th day, God told the Jews to march around Jericho, not once, but 7 times. Then they had to make as much noise as they possibly could. As they shouted and blew their horns, the great city walls began to rattle and shake, and enormous cracks appeared between the bricks. The Canaanites were horrified. Then, with a terrible rumbling crash, the walls collapsed all the way around the city. The people inside were much too frightened to fight, and all the Jews had to do was walk in and capture Jericho. After many battles and great adventures, the whole land was theirs. With God's help, the entire land of Canaan belonged to Israel, just as he had promised. "This is lovely," they said as they looked at the green fields and juicy fruit. Joshua told the priests to set up a tent for worshiping God on top of a high hill. Then he called everyone together and said, "God has been good to you. Now that you are safely here, will you continue to love and obey him?" "Of course we will," the people shouted. "And you won't start worshiping pretend gods like the Canaanites did," persisted Joshua. "Never," they all replied. How happy they all were as long as they kept that promise. Let's talk about the story. Press pause after each question and discuss the answer with your family. Number 1. The Jews had to wander in the desert for a very long time. Why? What had they done? Number 2. What very important lesson did the Jews learn in the desert? Number 3. How did the Jews conquer Jericho? What was God's plan? Number 4. Have you ever had a problem so big that you knew you couldn't solve it yourself? What did you do? And number 5. What are some situations that you have to trust God to take care of? The end.